The message that changed everything. Grace Sullivan had always believed that love could be repaired if you kept showing up for it, if you kept hoping, if you kept forgiving. She was 6 months pregnant and still told herself that maybe her husband's silence was just stress from work, that his late nights were deadlines and not distance. She kept reminding herself that people changed when a baby was coming, that fathers sometimes grew into love once they heard a heartbeat. That morning she stood in front of the mirror, one hand on her belly, whispering to the small life inside, promising that tonight might be different. Then her phone buzzed, a single message lighting the screen. "Special dinner tonight, 7 o'clock. I have a surprise for you." It was from Derek. No heart emoji, no smile, just words, but they were enough to make her chest flutter. She dressed carefully, choosing the soft blue dress he once said made her look like calm water. For the first time in months, she felt the smallest spark of hope. The sky was turning golden when she drove across town, her mind full of possible reasons for the invitation. Maybe he wanted to start fresh. Maybe he had finally realized how much they both needed peace before the baby came. She rehearsed small smiles, soft words of reconciliation, all the things she might say to mend what had cracked between them. The city glowed around her with early evening lights, and for a moment she almost believed life could still turn the right way. But as she parked outside the tall apartment building, something in her chest tightened. The message hadn't said where the dinner would be, only that she should come to this address. Still, she went in, carried by faith more than logic. When the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor, she heard laughter echoing from a distant hallway. It was bright, careless laughter, the kind that made her feel like an intruder before she even knocked. But she steadied her breathing and told herself not to imagine ghosts where none existed. She knocked once, then again. The door opened to reveal Vanessa, a woman she recognized from Derek's office events. Elegant, confident, the sort of woman who made everyone else feel underdressed. For a heartbeat, Grace thought she had the wrong door. But then Vanessa smiled with a familiarity that froze her. "Grace, come in, he's expecting you." The tone was friendly on the surface, but there was an undertow beneath it, something cold and watchful. Grace stepped inside, clutching the small pie she had baked that morning, a simple gift of normalcy. The living room shimmered with expensive lighting and perfume. 5 other women sat around a glass table with half-filled wine glasses. They looked at Grace not as guests meeting a hostess, but as judges regarding a case already decided. Derek stood near the window, back turned, phone in his hand. He didn't move to greet her, didn't even look up right away. The air felt too still. Grace's stomach tightened, not with the weight of pregnancy, but with instinct. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, yet she couldn't name it. Vanessa gestured to a chair, but Grace stayed standing, waiting for Derek to speak. When he finally turned, his expression wasn't surprise or joy. It was resignation, like someone watching a scene he no longer controlled. And then, without a word, he walked out of the room. What followed blurred into a storm of raised voices and accusations. The words sliced more deeply than any blow could have. "You ruined his life, or you trapped him. He never loved you." And the most devastating of all, "He doesn't want that baby." Grace tried to defend herself, tried to speak through tears that refused to stay inside, but the chorus drowned her. She remembered gripping the back of a chair to stay upright, her pulse hammering in her ears, and realizing that she was surrounded not by friends, but by people who despised the very idea of her existence. When she stumbled toward the door, someone blocked her way. Then everything dissolved into noise and the world went white. The next fragments were made of sound rather than sight. Sirens, hurried footsteps, voices calling her name. She awoke under blinding hospital lights, her mind floating between sleep and awareness. The smell of antiseptic thick around her. Machines beeped somewhere close, keeping rhythm with the fragile beat of her heart. When she finally recognized the hand holding hers, she tried to smile. "Tyler," she whispered, though her throat felt raw. Her brother leaned closer, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice a mixture of relief and fury. Safe. The word sounded strange. She was in a bed she didn't remember reaching, with bruises she didn't remember earning, and then she felt the small movement inside her belly, faint but real, and everything else vanished except that one miracle. Over the next few days, Grace learned the edges of what had happened, but not yet the full picture. Doctors spoke in careful tones about shock and exhaustion, about how stress could cause collapse. No one used the word attack. No one needed to. Tyler stayed beside her, taking calls, sending messages, his expression carved from stone. When she asked about Derek, he said only that the police were investigating. The others were on their way, he added quietly, meaning her brothers, the rest of the Mitchell line, the ones who had chosen uniforms and discipline over ordinary lives. Ryan, Connor, Blake, Hunter, Carson, Austin, and himself. 7 brothers bound by blood and the unspoken rule that no one hurt family and walked away free. The first night she managed to sleep, she dreamed of the ocean, of waves breaking over stone, relentless and cleansing. When she woke, Tyler was dozing in the chair, phone in his lap. She reached for the small heartbeat monitor beside her bed and listened to its steady rhythm. Her daughter, alive, fighting, refusing to surrender. Grace felt tears gather, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from gratitude. She whispered softly, "We're still here, baby. They tried to take everything, but we're still here." The promise formed itself in her chest. Whatever had been done to her, whatever betrayal had torn her world apart, she would not break. She would rise for herself and for the life growing within her. And when her brothers arrived, she knew the story would no longer be about what was taken from her, but about what she reclaimed. Her strength, her name, and her justice. That was the night Grace Sullivan stopped being afraid. That was the night the woman who once believed love could fix anything began to understand that some wounds demand truth, not forgiveness. Outside the window, the city glittered as though unaware of the war she had survived. But inside the quiet hospital room, a different kind of strength was being born. One that would not fade. One that would soon stand in courtrooms and headlines. One that would remind the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide the ending. The ICU awakening. The first true morning that Grace Sullivan remembered was painted in pale gold. The kind of light that filtered through hospital blinds and made the sterile walls look almost forgiving. The beeping of machines blended with the low hum of air conditioning and distant footsteps in the hallway. For a long moment, she didn't move. Just watched how the sunlight touched the silver fur pole beside her bed. Her body ached. Her head throbbed faintly. And yet somewhere underneath the pain was the quiet rhythm of another heartbeat. One that wasn't hers. The one inside her. It was the only sound that mattered. Her daughter was alive. That simple truth was like oxygen in her lungs, heavier and more necessary than anything she had ever known. Tyler was there again, still wearing the same fatigues he had arrived in, unshaven, his eyes carrying the shadowed exhaustion of a soldier who had seen too much and slept too little. When she stirred, he looked up instantly, his whole body tense until he saw her awake. "Morning, Gracie," he said softly, voice hoarse from too many hours of whispering instead of sleeping. He held up a cup of water, sliding a straw to her lips. "Small sips, okay?" She obeyed, every movement feeling deliberate, like waking up inside a body she no longer recognized. "You scared the hell out of me," he added, trying to sound light, but the tremor in his tone betrayed the truth. He had been terrified of losing her. Grace's voice came out fragile, barely a whisper.
"How long?"
3 days since they brought you in," Tyler said, choosing his words carefully as if each one might break her again. "You've been in and out, mostly sleeping. The baby's holding strong. The doctors say she's a fighter." His gaze softened as he looked at her stomach, and for a moment his expression wasn't that of a battle-hardened medic, but of a brother who'd once built tree houses for her in their backyard. Grace exhaled shakily. "I keep thinking it's a dream," she murmured. "That I'll wake up and it'll all be before that night." "I know," he said, "but this isn't a dream and you're safe now." That word again. Safe. She wasn't sure what it meant anymore. Safety had once meant home, marriage, promises. Now it meant machines and hospital walls and her brother sitting guard through the night. Later that day when the doctor came in, Grace listened in silence as Dr. Hendricks went over her recovery plan. The older woman had a kind of calm authority that made Grace trust her instantly. "You're strong," the doctor said. "Stronger than you think. But you'll need rest, proper nutrition, therapy for the stress. Physical and emotional healing go hand in hand, Mrs. Sullivan." At the mention of her last name, Grace's eyes flickered. Mrs. Sullivan. The name tasted different now, heavier somehow. "I think," she began, but her voice faltered. "I think I need to stop being that for a while." Dr. Hendricks gave a slow nod. "You don't have to make any decisions today. Just remember, you have the right to choose who you become next." When the doctor left, Tyler remained quiet, studying his sister. Connor's coming, he said finally. So are the others. Mom's on her way too. You know them. They're not taking this lightly. Grace turned her head toward him, her eyes clearer now, their blue sharper against the bruises that still faded slowly from her skin. They can be angry, she said, but I need them to be smart. I don't want revenge. I want the truth, Tyler frowned. You really think you can face him? After everything? Yes, she said firmly. Because if I don't, it'll define me, and I won't let that happen. That night she dreamed again, but this time it wasn't chaos or fear. It was memory of her father teaching her to swim, telling her that when the current is too strong, you don't fight it head on. You angle yourself, let it carry you until you can push back. When she woke, those words felt carved into her heart. She was going to let the current carry her for now, through recovery, through the storm of headlines and investigators, but soon, she would push back. By the next morning, the hospital room was alive with motion. Ryan, the eldest, arrived first, tall and composed, his presence immediately commanding the room like a field officer entering a briefing. He hugged her carefully, his jaw tight against her hair. You did good, kid, he murmured. You held on. Then Connor walked in, crisp and precise, his FBI badge glinting under the fluorescent light. We're going to get him, he said without introduction. Every message, every call, every payment, I'll find it all. Grace wanted to thank him, but all she could manage was a nod. By noon, the rest of the brothers had gathered, filling the sterile space with a different kind of energy, protective, unyielding, united. Carson stood by the window, arms folded, while Blake leaned against the wall, scanning the hallway like a man expecting an ambush. Hunter was already setting up a laptop on the small table, and Austin, the youngest, paced restlessly, clenching and unclenching his fists. For a moment, Grace simply looked at them, her 7 guardians, her living wall of strength. She saw the fury burning in their eyes, but also something deeper, love raw and relentless. Listen to me, she said, her voice soft but steady. I know what you're thinking. But this isn't a battlefield. It's a courtroom, and if you do anything reckless, it'll destroy everything. Ryan spoke first. We just want to protect you. I know, Grace replied. And the best way to do that is to let justice work. She hesitated, then added, I need to be the one who faces him. I need to say it out loud in front of everyone. What he did, what they planned. That's how I take back my power. The room went silent. Tyler looked like he wanted to protest, but Ryan placed a hand on his shoulder. She's right, the eldest said quietly. We fight this her way. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, feeling something settle inside her. Not peace exactly, but purpose. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about transforming the wound into something no one could use against her. When the detectives came later that afternoon, Grace gave her first official statement. She didn't cry this time. Her words were calm, almost detached, but beneath them pulsed an unwavering current of strength. She described the betrayal, the manipulation, the deceit that had nearly cost her and her child their lives. The officers listened in respectful silence, taking notes, occasionally exchanging glances when her details matched the evidence they already had. By the time they left, Grace felt lighter. The truth was heavy, yes, but speaking it aloud made it lose some of its power. She looked around the room at her brothers, her team, and realized she wasn't just recovering. She was leading them now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in amber light, Tyler helped her sit up higher in bed. She rested a hand on her stomach and smiled faintly when she felt the baby's gentle kick. She's strong, Tyler said softly. She'll have to be, Grace replied. She's a Mitchell. They both laughed quietly, and for the first time since that terrible night, the sound wasn't forced. It was fragile but real, a sound of life returning, of hope rebuilding itself from ruin. And somewhere deep inside, Grace made another silent promise, that this child would grow up knowing her mother's story not as one of pain, but as one of resilience. That one day when her daughter asked what happened, she would say, "We were betrayed, but we fought back. We were broken, but we rebuilt." Because Grace Sullivan was no longer the woman who waited for love to save her. She was the woman who would save herself, and in doing so, save every part of her future that still deserved light. The 7 brothers' oath. The hospital room had begun to feel less like a place of recovery and more like a command center. Grace could sense it every time one of her brothers walked in. The shift in energy, the undercurrent of strategy and purpose that followed them like a storm front. For the first time in her life, she realized how their military precision extended beyond the battlefield. Each brother had a specific rhythm, a particular role in the quiet, wordless operation that had formed around her. Ryan, the eldest, was the natural leader, composed and strategic, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Connor, with his FBI training, worked like a hawk, sharp and relentless in his pursuit of details. Blake was quiet but deadly in his efficiency, his eyes always scanning, measuring, anticipating threats before they arrived. Hunter and Carson operated as a unit, communicating with subtle glances, while Tyler, her healer and protector, remained the heart that kept them grounded. And then there was Austin, the youngest, whose anger simmered beneath the surface, barely restrained by the invisible discipline drilled into him by years of service. Together they were a wall of strength, the living embodiment of everything Grace had ever believed family meant. The morning they all gathered around her bed for the first time, the air was heavy with emotion that no one dared to name. Grace was sitting up now, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her hands resting protectively on the gentle curve of her stomach. The bruises were fading, but the echoes of pain still lingered in the way she breathed, slow and careful. Ryan stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes steady on his sister. "We need to talk," he said, his tone even, measured. "But before we do, I want you to know, we're proud of you. Every single one of us." Grace tried to smile, but it trembled. "You shouldn't have to be proud of me for surviving, Ryan," she said softly. "You should be proud of me for living after." Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening with emotion. "Then let's make sure that's exactly what you get to do." He turned to his brothers. "We've all agreed. No violence, no shortcuts, no revenge. We do this by the book. For her, for the baby, for all of us." Austin shifted restlessly in his seat. "By the book doesn't always work, Ryan, you know that. The system fails people every day. What if it fails her too?" "It won't," Connor said before Ryan could reply. His voice was cool, precise, almost unnervingly calm. "I've already spoken to the district attorney. This case isn't slipping through cracks. Between the messages, the witnesses, and the medical evidence, the prosecution has everything they need. What we need," he continued, glancing at Grace, "is to make sure she stays strong enough to testify when the time comes. That's how we win." Grace looked between them, her heart swelling with both gratitude and fear. "You make it sound like a mission," she said. "In a way it is," Blake replied, his voice deep and even. "Except this time you're the one leading it." The words landed with weight. Grace had spent her life surrounded by men who protected her, who fought her battles, who stood between her and danger. But this was different. This was them standing behind her, trusting her to face the storm herself. It made her chest tighten in a way that was both terrifying and empowering. That afternoon they sat together and went through everything. Every piece of evidence, every message, every fragment of memory. Connor spread out printed copies of text exchanges, phone records, bank transfers. Hunter had already traced the encrypted burner phone Vanessa used to contact Derek. Carson had mapped out the timeline down to the hour. Grace listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just staring at the papers, realizing that what had nearly destroyed her was now being dissected like a military op. There was a strange comfort in that, knowing her pain had become something tangible, something they could dismantle and neutralize. "Do you want to see him?" Tyler asked quietly when the meeting ended. Grace hesitated. The question hung in the air like smoke. "You mean Derek?" she asked. "Yeah," Tyler said. "He's still in custody. Detective Brennan said they'll allow a confrontation if you request it. Could help in court. Show you're not intimidated." For a moment, Grace's heart lurched. The idea of facing the man who had betrayed her so completely seemed unbearable. But then she remembered his face that night. Cold, indifferent, almost bored while her world shattered. The memory didn't ignite fear anymore. It ignited clarity. "Yes," she said finally. "I want to see him. But not as his wife, not as his victim, as the woman he underestimated." That evening, when the brothers stepped out to get coffee, Grace sat alone by the window, watching the sunset stain the sky in shades of copper and crimson. The hospital grounds below were calm, nurses wheeling patients in soft silence, the world continuing as though nothing monumental had happened. But for Grace, every heartbeat felt like a declaration. She thought of her daughter, the small life within her, and whispered a vow only the fading light could hear. You will never grow up afraid. You will never question your worth. You will know that your mother fought for you, not with fists but with faith. The next day, the confrontation took place in a quiet room at the police station. Grace was escorted in by Connor and Detective Brennan, who had made every precaution to ensure she felt safe. Derek was already seated behind a metal table, his wrists cuffed, his once confident posture replaced by the slouch of a man stripped of power. When Grace entered, he looked up, and for a fraction of a second something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, not sorrow, but surprise. He hadn't expected her to stand there, composed, head high, her presence steady as stone. You look different, he said finally, voice hoarse. I am different, Grace replied. You made sure of that. He shifted in his seat, attempting a smirk. You think you can win this, Grace? You think anyone will believe your version? Grace didn't flinch. It's not a version. It's the truth. And it's not just mine. It's written in every message you sent, every payment you made, every lie you told. You tried to bury me, Derek, but you forgot who I am. I have brothers who don't stay buried, and a daughter who already knows how to fight. Derek's smirk faltered. His eyes darted toward the window as if searching for an escape from the truth settling over him like a shadow. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice low and certain. You didn't break me. You built me. You built the woman who's going to testify, who's going to make sure you spend the rest of your life remembering what you did. And when you do, I hope you think about the woman you tried to erase and the child you never deserved to meet. For a long moment, there was only silence. Detective Brennan's pen stopped moving. Connor's jaw tightened, pride flickering behind his steady gaze. Grace stood tall, turned without another word, and walked out of the room. She didn't need to look back. Outside, her brothers were waiting. Austin reached for her first, his usual restlessness replaced by quiet awe. You did it, he said. No, Grace replied softly. We did it. That night, as the family gathered again in her hospital room, the mood was different. The air felt lighter, the tension less sharp. Ryan raised a glass of water, the closest thing to a toast in a sterile environment, and said, To Grace, to the sister who taught us that strength isn't in how hard you hit, but in how hard you rise. Everyone echoed the sentiment, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Grace allowed herself to smile without reservation. The battle wasn't over. The trial still loomed. The healing still stretched long ahead. But something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer surviving moment to moment. She was building something new, something solid. When the room finally grew quiet and her brothers began drifting out one by one, Grace leaned back against her pillows, the soft hum of machines once again filling the silence. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling the steady movement beneath. We're going to be okay, she whispered to her daughter. Because we have them. Because we have us. And somewhere deep in the night, as the moon climbed high over the hospital, Grace Sullivan slept not as a victim, not as a broken woman, but as a warrior reborn, carrying within her both the scars of what had been and the unshakable promise of what was still to come. The woman who refused to break. The verdict came on a morning heavy with gray clouds, the kind of sky that seemed undecided between rain and light, between ending and renewal. The courthouse was silent except for the soft hum of whispered prayers, shuffling papers, and the slow rhythmic ticking of the old brass clock mounted above the judge's bench. Grace Sullivan sat in the front row, her hands folded over her lap, her daughter's tiny bracelet wrapped around her wrist, a delicate pink ribbon with a single silver charm engraved with one word, hope. Her brothers surrounded her once more, each of them wearing the same composed expression, the kind that soldiers wear before they hear a final command. Yet beneath their composure lay a fierce, unspoken emotion, love, pride, and a quiet reverence for the woman they had watched rise from ruin. Across the room sat the people who had once called themselves her husband's friends, now stripped of the arrogance and malice that had once fueled them. Their faces were pale, drawn, their expensive clothes doing nothing to mask the hollowness in their eyes. Derek was in the center, his head lowered, his hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. He looked smaller now, not physically but spiritually, like a man who had spent too long inside a cell with his own conscience. The air was thick with tension as the jury filed back into the room, each one avoiding the eyes of the accused, but when they looked at Grace, There was something else, a quiet respect, the kind given to someone who had endured what others could barely imagine, and still chosen dignity over destruction. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression solemn. In the matter of the state versus Derek Sullivan and accomplices, the jury has reached a verdict. The words rolled through the air, heavy, final, electric. Grace's heartbeat quickened, but she kept her face still, her breath slow and even. The world had already taken too much from her. It would not take her calm. One by one, the verdicts were read. Guilty of conspiracy, guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of attempted harm to a pregnant woman, guilty on every count that mattered. Each declaration landed like thunder, shaking the air, breaking apart months of silence and pain. Derek's shoulders slumped. Vanessa gasped softly, and one of the others began to cry quietly into her hands. The courtroom erupted with murmurs, but Grace didn't move, didn't even blink. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the wooden table before her, her lips forming a single silent word that no one heard but her brothers understood. Justice. When the judge dismissed the jury, Grace stood slowly. Her legs trembled just enough for Ryan to slide a steadying hand beneath her arm, but she didn't need it for long. She turned toward the people who had nearly destroyed her life, who had laughed while she bled, who had celebrated while she lay unconscious, and she looked at them not with hatred, but with something far more powerful: release. "You don't own a single piece of me anymore," she said quietly, her voice carrying farther than anyone expected. "You tried to bury me, but you forgot that I was the soil, not the seed. Everything you did grew into something stronger. Thank you for showing me exactly who I was meant to become." Then she turned away, her steps slow but steady, and she walked out of that courthouse with her brothers following behind her like a silent army of loyalty. Outside, the sky finally opened and rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, as though the heavens themselves had been waiting for this moment to wash everything clean. Grace didn't run for shelter. She tilted her face upward, eyes closed, letting the cold drops mix with the warmth of tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since that night, the tears were not of pain, but of release. Tyler stepped beside her, placing his jacket over her shoulders, and whispered, "It's over, Gracie." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No," she said. "It's beginning." Weeks passed, then months. Life didn't return to normal. It built a new kind of normal, one rooted in strength rather than survival. Grace moved out of the old house that had once been her cage and into a small cottage by the sea, where the waves reminded her that even the fiercest storms eventually rest. Her brothers helped her furnish it, their laughter echoing through the walls like music, and when her daughter was born, a perfect, healthy little girl with her mother's blue eyes, every one of them was there. They named her Faith, because that was what had carried them through when nothing else could. Grace spent the early weeks sitting by the window, holding Faith against her chest, listening to the sea breathe in and out like a living thing. The sound calmed her, reminded her that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, a quiet process of learning how to live with scars instead of hiding them. One afternoon, as she watched the waves turn gold under the setting sun, she made a decision that would define her next chapter. She opened her laptop and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant, but soon they poured out. Every memory, every emotion, every lesson carved into her soul. Her story wasn't just for her anymore. It was for every woman who had ever been silenced, for every survivor who thought strength was a luxury, for every heart that had forgotten its own rhythm. Months later, her story was published. The Woman Who Refused to Break. It spread faster than she expected, shared across social media, featured in magazines, read aloud in classrooms and therapy centers. Messages began to flood her inbox from women all over the world, some whispering their gratitude, others telling their own stories of pain and survival. Each one felt like a seed planted in the soil of her healing, proof that her suffering had not been in vain. She responded to every message she could, often holding Faith on her lap as she typed replies that began with the same words: "You are not alone." As time passed, Grace turned her experience into something bigger than herself. She founded an organization dedicated to supporting women escaping abuse, providing counseling, legal aid, and safe housing. Her brothers, still her loyal army, became its first sponsors, using their skills to train volunteers, secure safety programs, and build protective networks. What had once been a family bound by tragedy had transformed into a force of hope. They called it the Phoenix Project, because from ashes, new life always rises. On the first anniversary of her trial, Grace returned to the courthouse steps. The sky was clear this time, painted in warm hues of orange and pink, and the air smelled of spring. She stood holding Faith in her arms, her brothers surrounding her once more, not in defense, but in pride. "This is where it ended," Ryan said quietly. "And where it began." Grace nodded, her gaze lifting toward the horizon. "Yes," she said softly. "It began the day I decided not to hate but to heal." She looked down at her daughter, who was reaching a tiny hand toward the sky, and smiled. "You'll grow up knowing, little one, that strength doesn't come from vengeance but from forgiveness. That love, real love, is never cruel, never violent, never conditional. You'll know that your mother fought not to destroy, but to rebuild." The wind carried her words into the open air, scattering them like blessings over the city that had once watched her fall and now watched her rise. Somewhere far below, the sea whispered back, eternal and steady, and Grace Sullivan, the woman who had been broken, betrayed, and buried, smiled through the sunlight. Because she was no longer a victim, no longer a name in a court file, no longer a woman defined by pain. She was a mother, a leader, a voice, a survivor. The living proof that even in the darkest chapters of life, the light of resilience can rewrite the ending. And as she walked down those courthouse steps, carrying her daughter against her heart, her brothers following behind her with quiet reverence, the world seemed to pause for a moment as if acknowledging her victory. Not of vengeance, but of courage, of faith, of rebirth. Grace Sullivan had risen, and she would never fall again.